Economists like to know the economics effects of taxes for a variety of reasons, but if you're interested in macroeconomic stability and you want to fight recessions or prevent inflation and such things, if you're interested in macroeconomics, such as Professor White talked about a few weeks ago, you're going to look at booms and busts and try and figure out what to do about them. This shows the 1920s through the 1960s. You can see the bust of the Great Depression, the boom with its inflation and price controls during World War II, and then we're back to that trend line that I did an extension of in the chart just a little while ago. So how do you smooth out the business cycle? That's one use of tax policy in the macro sense. And to do that, you have to have a theory about how taxes affect the size of the economy. Booms and busts tend to be short run, by the way. The economy normally heals itself eventually. So there's a little bit of a tension between short run macroeconomics and long run growth theory. And that leads to two very different views of how taxes affect the economy. Suppose for a moment, and if you've followed the textbook, you've got a familiarity with the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves here. The short-run aggregate supply is upward sloping. If you have more demand, you can get more output in the short run. When you get to full employment or capacity, of course, you can't go any further on a permanent basis, but at least in the short run, you can get some additional output. If demand is too low or the supply prices are too high, however, you could be at a situation like the E0, and here I'm showing you beginning in a recession, where the quantity of output is below full employment, where the equilibrium point is not on the long-run aggregate supply curve. Well, what do you do? Well, the classical economist said, have a drink and wait a few weeks. Because what will happen at that point is you have excess supply, prices will tend to fall, wages will tend to fall with the prices. You will get back to an equilibrium at a lower price level where demand has risen along the original demand curve to put you at an equilibrium like point EF1 with a lower price level. That price level should probably be labeled P1, not P0, but it's close enough for government work. Now, that might take a while, though, and in the Depression it seemed to take forever. So economists like Keynes came along and said, well, let's, instead of waiting for the supply price and the costs to fall with the deflation, let's boost the demand to make that unnecessary and get us to a point like E2. It will involve a higher price level, but we'll be back to full employment perhaps sooner. And that was the driving force between that notion of how to use taxes to promote counter-cyclical policies. So let's take a look and see how that kind of worked out. The Keynesian Insights involved the idea that output was consisting of spending by consumers, investors, and the government. It equaled total output. And if that was below full employment output, you wanted to boost it somehow to get to Y star full employment output. And it would involve a period of disinflation or deflation. While in a boom, GDP exceeds potential, C and I and G add up to too much spending, and that tends to boost prices, and it temporarily at least causes you to perhaps exceed potential output, and then wages and prices tend to rise, particularly when unemployment is very low. So the policy tools were this. In a bust, you would want to increase consumption and investment by cutting taxes. And that was assumed to give people more money to spend. It's a rise in disposable income or after-tax income. And the higher deficit would stimulate spending. In fact, the higher deficit would stimulate spending and raise the economy until what? Until out of the higher economy, a combination of additional taxes thrown off by the expansion and additional saving done by the population, which isn't spent, would drain enough of the original government input to exactly balance it, after which point there'd be no further stimulus. So a tax cut or a spending increase was always self-funding, not necessarily with taxes, but at least with taxes plus saving. It's rather mechanical, and people don't really think that way anymore. People get very concerned about the size of the debt and the effect of the borrowing on the credit markets and interest rates. But at the time, that was the basic Keynesian model. The other way of boosting demand was to ease monetary policy to lower interest rates to stimulate investment and consumption. So you could have the fiscal policy doing the work or the monetary policy doing the work. In a boom, you'd do the opposite. You'd raise taxes to take money away from people. You would cut spending, and you would tighten the money supply. Well, the idea basically, and taking out some of the excess lines in the previous chart, we're trying to move the demand curve up until we reach full employment. If you go any further, all you get is price increases. So how much do we have to shift the demand curve by one of these mechanisms, spending more, taxing less, and so forth? This leads to what's called multiplier analysis. If demand is 150 billion too low, remember that if you increase government spending by $1, it's going to trigger additional spending by the public. Now let's assume the public has to withhold half of the money for taxes and saving, about a 30% tax rate and a 20% saving rate, or take whatever number you want that adds up to 50 cents, because I can't do any complicated arithmetic. So we have a 50-cent add-on spending in the first round, and then 25 cents by the next person who gets the money, and then 12.5 cents by the person after that. It's an infinite series, which I know you realize from high school algebra, simply means that $1 government spending is going to trigger $2 in total spending. $1 in the private sector in addition to the $1 in the government sector. So if you're 150 billion too low in demand, the government should spend 75 billion more, and bingo, you're at full employment. If you cut taxes by $1, the first amount of that might be saved. Some of it might be saved. Saving is a bad thing if you're trying to stimulate consumption, right? So we're going to assume only 75 cents get spent into the second round, and that is drained by half taxes and half additional saving, so that it two doubles. So you've basically got $1.50 in total spending, not $2 out of the tax cut. So the spending is more powerful than the tax reduction. That was a key Keynesian principle. And they also noticed that if you increase government spending and taxes at the same time, since the spending multiplier was bigger than the tax cut multiplier, and therefore the obverse, not doing as much damage if you raise the taxes, you could increase taxes and spending, and the economy would continue to grow. What they didn't like to publicize was that all of the growth was in the government sector. There was none in the private sector if you did that. But anyway, you had these things called balanced budget multipliers. And that was the old-fashioned way of looking at things. Now, as I've mentioned before, a stimulus in a recession will raise inflation. And that's okay if the recession was causing prices to start falling to begin with. And restraint during a boom will fight inflation by raising unemployment. That's okay if the boom had reduced unemployment below its natural level and we were going too far. Just to mention to you that modern multiplier analysis isn't as simplistic as that old stuff about a constant multiplier for any form of government spending or any kind of tax cut. We now try to distinguish among tax changes as to which are more powerful and which are less powerful. And economists like Mark Zandi have tried to go through the types of government spending to see if they might have differential effects. He assumes that grants and tax cuts for the poor, such as food stamps and the earned income credit, are largely spent and have a higher multiplier, and the tax cuts for the rich or cuts in the corporate tax rate are saved or invested with a lag and have a smaller multiplier. This prejudice against saving in the basic Keynesian framework is at odds with long-run growth theory, where you need more saving to fund more investment, to have more capital for the workers to work with. That's the first problem with it. And the second problem with it is that you have to be assuming that income that is saved is simply in the mattress and is not recycled through the credit markets for somebody else to spend.